Hi Barry, here's the feedback for your mock paper 2 exam that you did just before Christmas. You started off well, you've got full 4 marks for the first question, so that's a good start. So if we move on to question 2, where you've been asked to write a summary of the differences between Eddie and Henry. I think you've got a little bit confused with this question because you've included a lot of analysis of the language used, and this is the one question where you don't need to do that. You're only comparing Eddie and Henry. So you start off here talking about Jay Rayner and about his experiences of being at school. So the first part up to here isn't really relevant to the actual question that you've been asked to do. However, here you've moved on. You said Eddie seems to be clever and his dad knows this. Eddie even asked him a question and you've given a quote of the rhetorical question. And you've used some inference here to say that Eddie might be cleverer than his dad, or he could just be joking at his dad, so using humour. And then you've gone on to talk about Henry writing the letter, but again you've focused on the language rather than what the letter's about, although here you have moved on to say that he's unhappy at school. But again we've gone back to using the language here. And even more language. So the language that you've used, that you've analysed, is good. However, that really needs to be in the next question, question 3. If we look at the mark scheme for this question, it says, show some interpretation from one or both texts. Well, you have considered both texts. Attempt some inferences from one or both texts. Well, you have made some inference, as I mentioned before, about Eddie being cleverer than his dad. You have selected some appropriate references and textual detail from one or both texts. However, some of them are not really relevant to this particular question because you've been talking about the language. And you have included some statements to show some of the differences between the texts. However, you would need to focus more on the differences between Eddie and Henry and try to use a bit more inference reading between the lines. So you would have scored higher mark if you'd talked about their attitudes towards their respective fathers, the fact that Eddie jokes, so he appears to have a good relationship with his dad. You can make fun of him, which showing that there is this good close relationship between them. Whereas Henry, in his letter, is much more polite, and you could say that it's possibly a cold relationship because they've not seen each other for 2 years. So that relationship isn't as close and as friendly as Eddie's is. You could have said that Eddie's a modern teenager who's got everything at home, possibly doesn't appreciate how well off he is compared to Henry, and given some description about the horrors that Henry finds at school, the things that they eat, the bread and so on. You have mentioned here that he's treated basically like an animal, so that is a good point. But you needed to make more points, more relevant quotes, and less about the language for this question. So I think here we'd score 4 out of the possible 8 for this question. So that's not bad. Moving on to question 3, which is the language question. How does Henry use language to try to influence his father? You've done quite well on this question. You started off saying he uses emotive language throughout his letter and given a good example, and explained what he's trying to do, how he's trying to make us feel bad for not writing to him. You've also mentioned the adjective unhappy to describe the predicament he's in. That's good. Moving on to the bears and Christians, you put a metaphor. This is actually simile because he uses more like bears than Christians. So although you've picked out that he's comparing, it is actually simile, and he's trying to make his father feel sympathetic and showing the way he's been treated. Continual mention of how he dislikes being at school. Again, the use of the verb flog is good, very powerful, and suggests an awful place to be in. So this is all good. And then you've got here, very loosely mentioned the fact that he's trying to get his dad to bring him home. This is a 12-mark question, so you do need to include at least 4 points on the various language techniques used, and you have done that. So if we look at the mark scheme and we look at the level 2, it says show some understanding of language. And the first bullet point is attempts to comment on the effects of the language. Well, I think you clearly have done that in several cases. Select some appropriate textual detail. Yes, again, you've included the quotes and they are relevant to the points that you're making. And the last one, make some use of subject terminology, mainly appropriately. You have used the subject terminology. It's mainly appropriately because, as we've already mentioned, you've used metaphor instead of simile. So we've covered all those bullet points there. So if we move on and have a look at level 3, which says shows clear understanding of language. And the first bullet point says explains clearly the effects of the writer's choice of language. Well, again, yes, I think you have. Selects a range of relevant textual detail. Yes, as we've already said that. And then the last bullet point makes clear and accurate use of subject terminology. So we haven't quite met that bullet point for level 3 because it's not all accurate misuse of metaphor. So if we see here at the bottom of the level, a student will have a level 2 and at least one of the skills descriptors. Whereas it says here at the top of the level, a student's response will meet all of the skills descriptors. So I think we are in band 3 because you've met all of the criteria for the level 2. But because we've not done that one, I think we're at the bottom end of the level 3. So I think that gives us 7 out of the 12, which is a good score, so well done. To gain higher marks, I think you needed to use some of the information that you've used in your question 4. As you said, I get the impression that Henry is totally trying to influence his father on changing his decision and coming to the rescue, because you've not really said what Henry's trying to achieve in writing the letter to his dad. So I think that would have been a good one, and then gone on to give some of the language used in there. You could have also mentioned that he uses direct address, so you and your, again trying to appeal to his father and put him in his shoes, or the fact that he uses repetition of the words my dear father on several instances could represent the fact that he's trying to tell his dad how much he cares about him and how much he misses him. But you could also go on to say that this could be a deliberate ploy to appeal to his father's finer feelings, because they've not actually seen each other for 2 years, so that bond can't be that close. So is it just a calculated use of language there? Moving on to question 4, I don't think you've read the question properly, because it says for this question you need to refer to the whole of source A together with source B, the father's letter to the family friend. So it's actually the second text in the Henry letters, and compare how the two writers convey their different attitudes to parenting and education. So you've done a good analysis of how Jay, his attitudes towards education and parenting. You suggested that Jay's a proud man and doesn't want his son to be able to humiliate him. And it could be achieved when Eddie realises his dad doesn't know some of the answers to the homework. The fact that Eddie does perform better than Jay. And then you've picked up on the end that he seems really proud of his son's achievement and uses a question at the end. I think you could have suggested that Jay uses humour to get his points across there, which would be looking at the writer's methods that he uses. But you have mentioned the rhetorical question there, so you've picked up on 1 point. But when we move on to the second part of the question, you're looking at the letter 1 when you needed to be looking at letter 2, and looking at how Henry's dad, how his attitudes are to parenting, because he's writing a letter in response to this letter from Henry to the family friend. So unfortunately you're not going to get any marks for this bit here. So if we have a look at the mark scheme, because you've used the wrong source document, you're going to be limited to a level 1. Because the first bullet point is make simple cross-reference of ideas and perspectives, and whilst you've done that, you've used the wrong letter, so you can't gain any marks for that. Make simple identification of writers' methods. Well, as I said, you did mention the rhetorical question, so we can class that as we've covered that bullet point because it's simple identification of writers' methods. The next one, makes simple references or textual details from one or both texts. Well, yes, you've included some quotes from J. Rayner's text, and you have shown some awareness of ideas or perspectives based on the J. Rayner text. So I think for this one, we have to give you 3 out of possible 16 marks. If I look at what you've actually written based on the Henry letter, you would have scored higher marks, obviously, because you have looked at the different way that he faces or he regards education. So he has a negative attitude, and you've given quotes. You've picked up on the fact that it's a very emotive letter with one purpose in it. So you have given a good consideration of his attitude towards education here, and you've given some good examples of the methods that he uses, where you said he's terrified of his teacher, he uses dear father quite often, emotive and empathetic sentences, very strong and biased. You've obviously not talked about his attitude towards parenting because clearly he's not a parent. If that had been the question, you would have needed to mention the fact that his father seems quite cold and distant to him, and the fact that they've not seen each other for 2 years. So again, I would think Henry has quite a negative attitude of parenting here. So you would probably have got at least level 2 towards the top end had this been the actual question that you were needing to answer. This gives you an overall score of 15 out of 40, which, considering this is the first time we've looked at paper 2 mock, isn't a bad score. You scored full marks on question 1 and above half marks on question 3. Question 2 you scored half marks, and the question that let you down clearly was the last question where you've misread the question. So I think for you it's to remember that question 2 on this paper only is the one where you don't need to mention language, and also make sure you read the questions properly and you're actually answering the question using the sources that you've been asked to consider. However, you're doing well. I'm very pleased with the answers that you've given, and I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be getting at least the band 4, if not higher, and we've got 5 or 6 months to make sure that you're getting there. So well done, and keep up the good work, keep up the 100% attendance, because clearly it is having a good influence, and the fact that you do know your homeworks and well as submitting them is obviously benefiting you. So well done.